On the wedding day, the groom, Ethan, was late and nowhere to be seen. His mother, Mrs. Harris, answered a call and announced that Ethan was being rushed to the hospital for leukemia surgery. To save him, I, without hesitation, signed the bone marrow donation form handed to me by Mrs. Harris. I died on the operating table. Our child couldn't be saved either. After my death, my spirit left my body, desperate to see the man I had loved for 6 years. But what I saw crushed me. Ethan was perfectly fine, holding his true love, Sophia, in his arms. They were in our wedding suite, the one I had sold to help with his company's financial issues. We finally have the money to stabilize the company, and I can marry you now, Ethan whispered to Sophia. It turned out he had faked his illness just to harvest my bone marrow so he could run away with her. When I opened my eyes again, I had returned to the morning of my wedding day. This time, I swore to make him pay. As I stood in the wedding hall, my heart no longer fluttered with the joy it had in my past life. All I felt was a burning hatred. If I remembered correctly, Ethan was with Sophia right now, whispering sweet nothings and promising a future together. Meanwhile, I was moments away from being abandoned on my wedding day, betrayed by both him and his mother, who would leave me to die. Back then, I had willingly walked into their carefully laid trap, blinded by love. The searing pain in my chest was unbearable as I thought about how I had wasted 6 years of my youth, only to face such a cruel ending. The image of the two of them wrapped in each other's arms haunted my mind. But there was no time to dwell on the past. If I wanted to change my fate, I had to act now. This wedding was nothing but a trap, and Ethan was never going to show up. I had barely slept the night before, too consumed with thoughts of what was to come. By 3 a.m., I had been wide awake, obsessively preparing for the ceremony. Now, lightheaded from exhaustion, I stumbled and reached for a piece of wedding candy from the table to steady myself. That was when Mrs. Harris stormed over and shoved me forcefully. "What are you doing? Do you think this family hasn't treated you well enough? And now you're stealing from the guests?" She hissed. The guests turned to stare, their eyes filled with ridicule and judgment. Mrs. Harris had always humiliated me in public under the guise of teaching me a lesson, claiming it was to prevent me from bullying Ethan in the future. In my previous life, I had swallowed my pride, unwilling to create drama and put Ethan in an awkward position. My tolerance had only emboldened her. Ethan had never once defended me, but this time, I clenched my fists. I had decided to take revenge, and I wouldn't tolerate a single ounce of disrespect. I slowly rose to my feet, walked to the center of the hall, and announced, "Everyone, the wedding is off. You can all go home." A collective gasp filled the room. I, who had always been the epitome of patience and composure, was now calling off the wedding without warning. After all, Ethan and I had been the picture-perfect college sweethearts, envied by many. Mrs. Harris scowled and tried to calm me. "Mia, don't make a scene. Ethan has been working so hard for the company lately. He's just running a little late. Can't you be more understanding?" She continued. "And what's this about? Just because I said one thing to you, you're throwing a tantrum." Ethan's company was indeed in trouble. But what Mrs. Harris didn't know was that I was the company's majority shareholder. I had planned to reveal my true identity as the heiress of a prominent family after the wedding. My family had opposed our relationship, but I believed that once we were married, my father would have no choice but to help Ethan's business. But now, all of that seemed laughable. My elaborate plans had only made me look like a fool. Ethan hadn't been reachable since the night before. Even now, he hadn't shown up. Anyone would find that suspicious. "Mrs. Harris," I said with a cold smile, "are you trying to cover for Ethan? Do you even know why he's not here today? Or are you deliberately trying to mislead everyone?" My voice carried across the room. Him not showing up is not only a slap in my face but also an insult to everyone here. If he doesn't care, why should I? Before I could leave, Mrs. Harris's phone rang. She raised her voice, announcing, "Everyone, calm down. It's Ethan's secretary. He must be delayed because of work." The room fell silent as she answered the call. But the voice on the other end wasn't the secretary's. It was Sophia's. "Mrs. Harris," she said in a sickly sweet tone, "Ethan has been diagnosed with acute leukemia. He's being rushed to the hospital now. What? Mrs. Harris shrieked. What did the doctor say? They said he needs a bone marrow transplant immediately. Sophia replied. By the way, doesn't Mia have the same blood type as Ethan? Maybe she can help. All eyes turned to me. Mrs. Harris approached, her voice trembling. Mia, please, for the sake of the years you've been with Ethan, won't you help him? I stepped back, avoiding her grasp. This scene was all too familiar. In my past life, overcome with grief and worry, I had agreed without hesitation, and it had cost me my life. But not this time. Sensing my reluctance, Mrs. Harris's expression darkened. She turned to the guests and wailed dramatically. Everyone, please help me convince her. You all know how much Ethan has done for her. She can't turn her back on him now. The guests chimed in, adding to the pressure. But I smiled coldly. Do you even know if I'm a match? Shouldn't that be determined first? Besides, wouldn't a direct relative have a better chance of being compatible? My sharp response left them speechless. Some of my friends finally stepped in, saying, she's right. Why force her without even confirming compatibility? Mrs. Harris's face turned pale. After a moment, she burst into tears, wailing about how she was being mistreated and how I was ungrateful. I pulled out my phone and calmly called my private doctor. I turned on the speakerphone and grabbed the microphone from the MC, speaking loudly and clearly. My voice echoed through the hall as I recited examples of successful bone marrow transplants from direct relatives. I fixed my gaze on Mrs. Harris. Did you hear that? I only have one husband. Are you sure you want to be the one to abandon him? I said mockingly. Seeing that I was unmoved, Mrs. Harris's expression turned vicious. Listen, Mia, you will donate that bone marrow whether you like it or not. It's not up to you. She spat. No sooner had she finished speaking than several burly men surrounded me. They grabbed my arms and began dragging me away. The friends I had invited to the wedding were too few to intervene effectively. I struggled with all my strength, but the more I resisted, the tighter their grip became. Panic set in. This was far worse than in my previous life. Back then, things hadn't escalated to this point. Amid the chaos, I pressed a shortcut button on my phone. Before I knew it, they had taken me to the all-too-familiar hospital. In my previous life, I hadn't even undergone a compatibility test before being forced onto the operating table. A long needle had pierced my body, the pain leaving me trembling uncontrollably. Ethan never intended for me to survive. He and his family had mercilessly extracted everything of value from me. The thought made my stomach churn with disgust. What was even more absurd was that this hospital had been acquired under my initiative for the benefit of the company's employees. Yet Ethan had used it to commit such heinous acts. The men dragged me into the operating room and threw me onto the surgical table with a force that sent a sharp pain through my back. Despite the pain, I gritted my teeth and forced myself to sit up. I couldn't die here. I hadn't exacted my revenge yet. Are you seriously going to do this to me? In front of so many people? I growled, my voice cold and defiant. Mrs. Harris pushed a nearby doctor forward and barked. Tie her down. Do it now. I glared at the doctor holding the syringe. Who dares touch me? I snapped. I am Mia Lin, heiress of the Lin family. The doctor hesitated, his hand trembling slightly. Mrs. Harris. She really is a Lin, he stammered. Others in the room froze, exchanging nervous glances. Everyone knew the consequences of crossing the Lin family. Seeing the hesitation, Mrs. Harris kicked the doctor and snatched the syringe from his hand. She stormed toward me, grabbing my hair roughly. What are you afraid of? She's no heiress. If she is, I'll kneel and knock my head on the floor 10 times. Taking advantage of her arrogance, I bit down on her arm with all my strength. She screamed in pain. But before anyone could react, a familiar voice echoed through the room. What do you think you're doing? I looked up to see Mr. Lee, the butler who had raised me, storming into the operating room. He grabbed Mrs. Harris's arm, forcing her to release me. A commanding voice followed from the doorway, laced with cold authority. Who dares act so audaciously? The crowd parted to reveal my father. His tall figure exuded the confidence and power I had missed so dearly in my past life. My eyes brimmed with tears as I stared at him. The last time I had seen him, his once proud demeanor had been crushed under the weight of grief over my death. Now, Seeing him full of vitality filled me with a surge of complex emotions. The doctor turned pale. "Mr. Lin, we didn't expect you to come." Mrs. Harris's expression shifted immediately. She forced a smile. "Mr. Lin, we were just handling a family matter. We didn't mean to trouble you." My father cast a cold glance at her and let out a chilling laugh. "If I hadn't come, my daughter would have died at your hands." Mrs. Harris trembled, her mind racing for an explanation. She had assumed no one important would intervene, especially not me. Realizing she had no choice but to gamble, she changed her tone. "Mia, it was all just a misunderstanding. I was desperate to save Ethan. You love him, don't you? You want him to get better, right?" Her words dripped with manipulation, attempting to exploit the love I had once foolishly given Ethan. She had always used my devotion against me, but I was no longer the naive Mia of my past life. I tilted my head slightly and replied coldly, "You should know, Mrs. Harris, that if my family lifts a finger, Ethan's company will crumble overnight." Her face turned ashen, and she quickly bowed. "I'm so sorry. Mia, please, forgive me. I wasn't thinking straight." Her once overbearing demeanor had vanished, replaced by groveling desperation. But I had no intention of letting her off that easily. I let a sly smile spread across my face. "Then, as you said, go ahead and bow your head 10 times. My tone was calm, but I could feel the malice radiating from me. After all, I was a vengeful ghost who had crawled back from hell. Mrs. Harris stepped back, stumbling and falling to the floor. Her teeth clenched as her mind raced. So, she really is a Lin. For Ethan to rise to success, I'll have to retreat for now. Once Mia marries into the Harris family, she'll be at my mercy." I watched as humiliation washed over her face. Slowly, she bent down, her head hitting the floor one time after another. Drops of blood began to seep from her forehead, but she persevered. "Daughter-in-law," she began weakly. "Call me Miss Lin." I interrupted coldly. Her head snapped up in shock. Blood trickled down her brow as my icy tone cut through the air. "Is that enough?" I asked flatly. "Apology not accepted." Her stunned expression morphed into one of fury. She fumbled for her phone to call for help, but with a simple glance from me, Mr. Lee, our butler, stepped forward and kicked her phone away. "Confiscate her phone," I ordered. "Take her for compatibility testing. She is not to leave the hospital without my permission." Without waiting for her protests, she was gagged and escorted out of the room. The remaining crowd dispersed quickly, leaving only me and my father in the operating room. Taking a deep breath, I steadied myself and turned to him. "I don't want to marry Ethan anymore." He sighed deeply but didn't argue. Instead, he stepped forward and gently placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Good girl. Let's go home." On the drive home, the surrealness of it all weighed heavily on me. My father's protective presence made me feel safe, and I was grateful that I had the chance to undo my past mistakes. In my previous life, after my death, Ethan's cruelty had extended to my family, robbing my parents of their peaceful old age. The thought of their suffering ignited a renewed hatred within me. This time, I vowed to protect them and make Ethan pay. When we arrived home, I told my parents everything that had happened. My mother clutched my hand, tears streaming down her face. "I always said Ethan wasn't the right man for you. How dare they do something so vile?" she cried. "I'll make sure every company in a city blacklists him. How dare he mess with the daughter of Lin Chang'an?" Even my father, usually calm and composed, expressed his anger on my behalf. Their love and concern moved me deeply, but I shook my head firmly. "Mom, Dad, I know you're worried about me, but please, let me handle this myself. I promise I won't let him off lightly." They hesitated but finally agreed, though reluctantly. They didn't know what I had been through. They only wanted me to stay far away from that despicable man. Looking at their youthful faces, I silently vowed that I would never let them worry about me again. After dinner, I retreated to my room. It had been years since I'd stayed at home, as my previous life had been consumed by Ethan's demands. Lying on the soft bed, I couldn't stop the tears from flowing. The man I had loved for 6 years had turned out to be a monster. I had always suspected that something wasn't right between Ethan and Sophia, but my love for him had blinded me. allowing him to use my feelings as a shield for his deceit. It was unforgivable that he had betrayed me, but his attempt to take my life had pushed me beyond the point of no return. Through the night, I planned my next steps carefully, formulating a strategy to bring Ethan down piece by piece. The next morning, I dragged myself downstairs with dark circles under my eyes. My parents were surprised to see me up so early, as I usually slept in when I was home. I grinned and wrapped my arms around my mother. "I just wanted to spend more time with you," I said playfully. After a leisurely morning with my family, I left the house, accompanied by Mr. Lee. He dropped me off at what used to be my wedding home with Ethan. The moment I stepped inside, memories flooded back. Every corner of the house had been decorated meticulously by me. At one point, I had dreamed of raising our children here and living a blissful life. Now, the very thought made me nauseous. I forced myself to walk to the master bedroom. If my memory served me right, in my previous life, I had already died in the hospital by this time. Meanwhile, Ethan and Sophia had used this very room to celebrate their twisted union. I pushed open the door, and a foul stench assaulted my senses. Sweat and other unspeakable odors hung in the air. The bed was in complete disarray. The sheets crumpled and stained. Scraps of paper littered the floor, and the quilt, painstakingly sewn by my mother, lay discarded on the ground, wrinkled and abandoned, much like my failed marriage. I took a deep breath, suppressing the urge to destroy everything. Instead, I methodically installed cameras throughout the room. Collecting evidence was more important than giving in to my emotions. Once I was done, I sat on the living room couch and waited. It wasn't long before I heard laughter and playful chatter outside the door. Soon, the sound of keys turning in the lock reached my ears. Sophia's voice rang out, cheerful and carefree, as though she and Ethan were a blissful newlywed couple. The door opened, and Ethan froze in the doorway when he saw me. His face turned pale, and he nearly bolted. But I smiled warmly and stood up. "Ethan," I said, feigning relief. "You're okay. I was so worried about you." Seeing that I wasn't immediately accusing him, Ethan hesitated, then cautiously responded, "Mia, what are you doing here?" I tilted my head and gave him an innocent look. "What do you mean? This is my house, isn't it? But why aren't you at the hospital? I've been so worried about you." Right, he stammered, clearly flustered. "The doctor said it's just early stages. I didn't need to stay, so I came back." His words stumbled over themselves as he tried to appear calm. "Where's Mom?" I nodded knowingly. Ethan's question had a clear purpose. Yesterday, his mother was supposed to handle everything about me. I feigned a look of confusion. "I don't know. Yesterday, I went to the hospital, thinking I was going to save you, but the doctor said we weren't a match. After hearing that, your mom left with the doctor, and I haven't been able to reach her since." "That doesn't make sense," Ethan muttered under his breath. His brow furrowed. Of course, it didn't make sense. They had planned everything. Regardless of whether I was a match, they weren't going to let me walk away. I sneered internally but kept my expression filled with concern. "Strange," I said, tilting my head innocently. "What does it mean? Do you not trust me anymore? And after I worried so much about you yesterday?" Ethan snapped out of his thoughts, waving his hands. No. How could I not trust you? I know my wife has my best interests at heart." But his eyes betrayed him, flickering nervously toward the master bedroom. Feigning curiosity, I teased, "What's wrong? Are you hiding someone in there?" The color drained from Ethan's face. He stammered incoherently, but I had no intention of listening to his excuses. I cut him off with a dismissive laugh. "Relax. I'm just joking. I've got some things to take care of at home, so I'll leave now." As I walked past Sophia, who was standing behind Ethan, I couldn't resist a pointed comment. "Oh, and your little secretary is here too? Be sure to take good care of Mr. Harris tonight." Without waiting for a response, I left. Back at home, I sprawled across my bed, satisfied. For the first time in ages, I wasn't preoccupied with pandering to a man. The peace and freedom felt like a luxury I hadn't enjoyed in a long time. As I considered where to go shopping the next day, my computer beeped with an alert. My surveillance software had picked up activity. Excited, I sat up and opened the program. pulling up the live feed from the cameras I had installed. On screen, Ethan and Sophia were sitting on the bed, talking. I turned up the volume. Their conspiratorial voices came through clearly. "I thought you said she wouldn't come back," Sophia complained, her tone laced with fake indignation. Despite her words, her body leaned intimately against Ethan. "I didn't lie to you," Ethan snapped, furrowing his brow. "Let me call Mr. Wong and find out what happened." Mr. Wong, the black market dealer who was supposed to handle the bone marrow transaction, answered the call. "What happened yesterday?" Ethan demanded. "I delivered her to you." "You delivered her? Huh. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've caused?" "It's too risky now," Mr. Wong retorted angrily. "What about the money you promised me?" Ethan pressed, panic rising in his voice. "Money? Forget it. The deal's off. Don't contact me again," Mr. Wong barked before hanging up. Ethan stared at the phone, his face darkening. How could this happen? What about the money? How will I save the company? Sophia reached out, stroking Ethan's cheek with a soft smile. "Don't worry, darling. I talked to the finance department today. They said the company can hold on for at least another month. As for raising money, I'm sure you'll figure something out. If it didn't work this time, we can just try again." Hearing this, Ethan visibly relaxed. The two soon fell into behaviors that disgusted me beyond words. I saved the video with a cold expression. Initially, I hadn't planned to target Sophia, believing that the blame for infidelity lay with the man. If Ethan wanted to cheat, there would always be another Sophia, another woman willing to play the role. But after hearing her words, I realized she was just as complicit in plotting against me. If Sophia loved selling out others, I'd make sure she paid for it too. As I finalized my plans for revenge, I suddenly remembered the company. Ethan's job had always been a favor from me. Fresh out of college, he had struggled to find employment. His arrogance outmatched only by his incompetence. Feeling sorry for him, I had secretly pulled strings to get him hired. The company's current financial trouble was no surprise. I had never expected Ethan to excel. My only hope back then was for us to marry and build a life together. I called the company to get an update. It was in shambles. Most of the talented employees I had hired had resigned, unable to tolerate Sophia's influence. She had turned the office into a hub of favoritism, where currying favor with the boss was the only way to get ahead. Frustrated, I ordered the remaining employees to stop reporting to Ethan. I reached out to the former staff, inviting them to work at another company I owned. I made it clear that all operations were being transferred there, leaving Ethan's company as little more than an empty shell. "Keep this confidential," I instructed. "Let them think they're still in control." It was past 1 a.m. by the time I finished. I went downstairs to find my father still awake. Smiling, I leaned on his shoulder. "Dad, why are you still up so late?" "You little rascal," he teased. "Why aren't you asleep?" "I'm different. I need you to age slower so you can stay with me longer," I said, pressing my cheek against his. He set down his newspaper and studied me. "Something's changed about you. You've grown up, haven't you? Caring about your old man now. You and Mom don't need to worry about me anymore," I said, my voice soft. "As long as I'm happy and healthy, that's all that matters." "Right." My father's eyes softened, and he pulled me into a hug. "You're growing up, but sometimes you're still just my little girl." He chuckled. I didn't say anything, just hugged my kind-hearted father tightly. The company's immediate crisis was resolved, and worse outcomes were prevented for now. I also kept a close eye on Ethan's phone to make sure he didn't contact anyone else for help. Ethan valued nothing more than his career and reputation, and I planned to attack him where it hurt most. Time was running out. Sophia had said they could barely hold on for another month. Ethan was panicking like a cat on a hot tin roof. Without money, how could he maintain his life with his precious sister? Sophia wasn't any easier to deal with. Back when Ethan was playing the role of a successful businessman, he'd spend hundreds of thousands each month on her. But now, with their finances in shambles, Sophia had begun throwing tantrums, her charm slowly becoming a burden. Ethan's face was etched with worry, too preoccupied to pacify her. Eventually, Sophia's thoughts drifted back to me, his so-called loyal wife. Over the past month, I had crafted the illusion of dire financial straits, to the point where Ethan could barely afford bread and pickles. Meanwhile, I decided day by day whether I felt like feeding him a proper meal. One evening, after finishing a hearty dinner at home, I packed up some leftovers and headed to Ethan's place. To add to the charade, I even brought a few bottles of his favorite wine. Ethan devoured the scraps ravenously, and the sight disgusted me. How had I ever loved someone like this? Looking away, I opened a bottle of wine and handed it to him. As the drinks flowed, Ethan's gaze softened, a hint of sentiment creeping into his eyes. Mia, you were there when I started the company, and now, even when I'm down, you haven't abandoned me. It's so good to have you by my side. He reached out to grab my hand, but I deftly avoided him, playing along. We've been together for 6 years. Ethan, if I don't support you, who will? My words were half true. The old Mia had genuinely loved him, but the current Mia, the one who had crawled back from hell, was simply performing. Ethan downed another drink and suddenly spoke. Mia, you know Mr. Yu from that last party? He secretly asked for your number. Said he'd pay 50 grand for one night with you. Yu was a businessman ranked just below my family in terms of wealth, though much of his fortune came from dubious sources. He was notorious for his vices, and this presented the perfect opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Destroy Ethan and eliminate a competitor from my family. Really? I asked, pretending to consider. You'd want me to go? Ethan's expression turned hopeful. Would you? For me. My gaze grew icy. Of course. Not in a million years. Ethan's body slumped against the table, unconscious from the sedatives I'd spiked in his wine. I called Mr. Lee. Uncle Lee, everything's ready on my end. How about you? It's all set, he replied. By 10 p.m., the night was just beginning. I arrived at the venue, where Mr. Lee was waiting for me in the lobby. I gracefully ascended the stage and addressed the gathered guests, my voice warm and composed. I deeply apologize for the incident at the wedding. Tonight's dinner is on Mr. Harris as a gesture of thanks for your continued support. Applause broke out. Someone in the crowd asked, "Where's Ethan?" Suppressing the excitement bubbling inside me, I answered with a smile, "No need to worry. Ethan invited everyone here, including the company's employees, to celebrate overcoming our recent challenges. He wanted to show his gratitude and asked me to share the company's progress with you." As I spoke, the large screen behind me lit up, but instead of company achievements, the footage showed 2 intertwined bodies on a bed. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Feigning panic, I stammered, I'm not sure what this is. There must be some mistake." But everyone was too engrossed in the scandalous video. As the footage reached its climax, the faces of the 2 individuals came into full view. It was Ethan and Mr. Yu. The crowd descended into chaos, and Ethan's reputation was utterly destroyed. The sedatives were strong, and Ethan remained unconscious until morning. By then, his phone was inundated with messages. I sat by his bedside, eagerly awaiting his reaction. When he finally woke and saw the news, his face turned pale, and he nearly fainted again. I slapped him awake, and he stared at me, trembling. What is this? I need to go to the hospital." "You want to go to the hospital?" I sneered. "Sophia said you had a plan to make money, but, darling, we're broke. Get used to it." I buried my face in my arm, stifling a laugh as Ethan's panic turned to fury. "Where's Sophia? Bring her here," he roared. "Oh, she's been busy dating lately," I replied nonchalantly. I had deliberately introduced Sophia to one of my childhood friends, a minor businessman who was playing along with my scheme. Ethan's face darkened further, but I continued to taunt him. "What's wrong? Darling, she's a young woman. Isn't she allowed to fall in love? You can't expect her to keep slaving away for the company forever." At this, Ethan finally passed out. Even a few slaps couldn't wake him. 3 days later, I saw him again. He looked thinner, his once confident demeanor completely gone. Yet, Sophia had returned to his side. I heard that Ethan had tried to report the incident to the police, but Mr. Yu had settled it privately with money, essentially selling Ethan out in the process. I was in an excellent mood. Sophia loved selling others. Let's see who could outsell whom. Though Ethan and Sophia appeared to reconcile, they had no idea that every step they took was still under my control. After learning Ethan received a small settlement, I had my friend cut off ties with Sophia. As expected, she quickly returned to leech off Ethan, further draining his already dwindling resources. The contrast between the frail, desperate Ethan and the once proud man he used to be brought me a twisted sense of satisfaction. Since my rebirth, I had been radiating confidence and beauty. Weekly spa treatments, regular gym sessions, and self-care brought me back to the vitality I had after graduating college. Compared to my past life of tirelessly sacrificing for a man, I was now glowing with independence. When I saw Sophia again, her jealousy was almost palpable. "Sister-in-law," she said, her voice laced with faux concern. "I mean no offense, but while Ethan is working himself to the bone for the company, you seem to have plenty of time to doll yourself up. If someone didn't know better, they'd think you were already looking for someone new." I didn't take the bait. Instead, I glanced at the designer bag on her arm, a recent release and undoubtedly bought with the last of Ethan's emergency money. "Oh my, Miss Sophia," I said with a smile, "that's quite a nice bag you've got there. Is it a gift from a promising new company that's taking you in? Or was it bought with Ethan's hard-earned money?" Sophia froze, her face flushed with embarrassment. She turned to Ethan for support, but his face darkened at the reminder of their financial struggles. "Enough," he snapped at Sophia. "Just shut up already. Haven't things been messy enough?" He stormed off in frustration, leaving Sophia standing awkwardly. Watching him limp away with defeat in his every step, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Yet, it wasn't enough. I wanted more. With Ethan's reputation in shambles, no company dared to collaborate with him. Rumors spread about the downfall of this once promising dark horse. The little money they'd managed to scrape together was now gone, and the cracks in Ethan and Sophia's relationship were growing wider. Without money to smooth things over, even the strongest bonds could crumble. Ethan was losing his grip. The combined agony of betrayal and professional failure was driving him mad. He turned to drinking, and when drunk, often lashed out physically at Sophia. One day, while lounging on my plush bed under the guise of working, I tuned into the surveillance cameras to watch another one of their inevitable fights. This time, it escalated further than usual. Ethan slapped Sophia hard across the face, shouting, "How did I ever end up with someone like you? At least Mia knows how to support the household. But you? All you do is ask me for money." Sophia shot back. "And now you think she's better? Let me tell you something, Ethan. I'm not here to suffer for you. If you can't provide, don't blame me." Her words cut deep, sparking another round of violence. I sighed, slightly bored by the repetitive drama. Just as I was about to close the laptop, something caught my attention. The two of them were scheming to sell my house. I sat up straight. This house was a gift I'd given Ethan, with both of our names on the deed. Now he dared to turn against me? Ethan, ever the dreamer, said, "Mia's so understanding. She'll forgive me once I get back on my feet. I'll buy the house back eventually." I let out a cold laugh and made a call. Ethan managed to quickly find a real estate agent, willing to help him sell the property. The agent promised to transfer the funds immediately upon closing, but insisted on inspecting the house first. Ethan, blinded by desperation, readily agreed and took Sophia along. As soon as they left, I arrived with my team. Without hesitation, I grabbed a hammer and began smashing every corner of the house. Furniture, walls, and fixtures. Everything was reduced to rubble. By the time I was done, the house was unrecognizable, a heap of destruction that erased every trace of my past. When Ethan returned with the agent, he froze in the doorway, staring at the devastation. Before he could react, the agent, following my instructions, rushed forward and punched Ethan. "You're trying to sell me this? A gutted house? Do you know how much business I've lost because of you?" The agent roared, landing another blow. Ethan, dazed and weak, could only stammer in confusion, exhausted from everything he'd been through. He didn't even have the strength to call the police. He lay amidst the ruins, feverish and staring blankly at the ceiling. "Mia," he murmured, his thoughts foggy. Could she have done this? Ever since she came back from the hospital, nothing has been the same. Just as I thought there was nothing more I could do to torment him, Mr. Lee brought me a lab report. My eyes lit up. It was a successful compatibility match for Mrs. Harris. A new plan began to take shape. I returned to the wrecked house and found Ethan delirious with fever. I stuffed some fever medicine into his mouth, waiting until he slowly regained consciousness. As he opened his eyes, I wiped away fake tears and sobbed. "Ethan, what happened to us? Did you offend someone? I used all of this month's salary to buy you fever medicine." Ethan, surprisingly moved, looked at me with a glimmer of emotion. "Mia, every time I'm at my lowest, you're always there for me." I cut him off, gasping dramatically. "Ethan, are you in the late stages of leukemia?" I covered my mouth, pretending to stifle sobs. Ethan froze, unsure how to respond. He hesitated, struggling to find words to explain his earlier lie. I shook my head, tears streaming, and ran out of the house. Once outside, I made another call. Meanwhile, Ethan lay on the bed, replaying the scene in his mind. He thought about how heartbroken I had looked, convinced of his illness. "She really loves me," he muttered to himself. Back in college, Ethan had believed he'd never find true love. Marrying someone like me had seemed practical. But when Sophia reappeared in his life last year, he had made the same mistake all men make. Despite everything, I hadn't abandoned him. His eyes welled up at the thought. But just as he began to convince himself of my unwavering devotion, his phone rang. It was Mr. Wong, the shady middleman. "Hey," Wong said, his voice casual. "Business is back on. Are you still short on money?" I asked. Hope flickered in Ethan's eyes, as if my question had healed half of his misery. "Yes, I'll do it. I'll go," he said eagerly. Then, hesitating, he added cautiously, "But Mr. Wong, can we use someone else this time?" This caught Mr. Wong off guard. And me too. But I motioned for him to continue following the script. "Sure. Same terms as before," Mr. Wong said reluctantly after glancing at me. Back in the room, Ethan grabbed my hand excitedly. "We're going to have money soon. Everything will be okay." I smiled faintly, already knowing he had decided to abandon Sophia in this transaction. Yet, no matter his choice, my plan remained unchanged. The day of the surgery for Mrs. Harris arrived. I brought Ethan to the hospital, claiming he needed a medical checkup. Once there, I revealed the true purpose. "Darling," I said gently, "someone's willing to donate bone marrow for you. You just need to go through with the surgery. Don't worry about the money. It's all taken care of." Ethan's face paled with shock. He opened his mouth to protest, but in his weakened state, he was easily restrained and escorted into the operating room by the doctors. The surgery went smoothly. Mrs. Harris's bone marrow was extracted, leaving her lifeless on the operating table. As for Ethan, I had only instructed the doctors to sedate him for a couple of hours. When he finally woke up, I took his hand with exaggerated joy. "Darling, you've been saved. The doctor says you're going to be fine." Ethan, still groggy and full of doubt, "Let me guide him." "Come on," I said. "You need to personally thank the person who stepped up to save you." I led him to the morgue. Ethan followed reluctantly, a deep unease growing within him. His mind buzzed with questions. Why would someone volunteer to save me? And why am I not sick in the first place? But these thoughts stayed locked inside, unspoken. Standing before the covered corpse, a voice in his head urged him, open it, and you'll understand everything." Ethan reached out hesitantly, pulling back the white sheet. The sight before him made him stumble backward, falling to the ground. His mouth moved silently for a moment before a single word escaped. "Mom!" Mrs. Harris lay cold and lifeless beneath the sheet. She had died in his place. Ethan broke down, teetering on the edge of insanity. His anguished cries echoed through the empty hall. I forwarded the recording of Ethan's final phone call with Mr. Wong to Sophia. What she would do with the information was anyone's guess. As for Ethan, the evidence I had gathered of his infidelity and other scandals would follow him to every job application, tarnishing his reputation permanently. The people who had wronged me had finally received the punishment they deserved. It was time for me to move forward with my life.